Welcome! In this video, we'll continue on with Chapter 7, and by the end of the video, you should understand the mechanisms for the biological clock, specifically what brain region or regions are involved, and what hormones play a role in regulating our biological clock for sleep. So the mechanisms of the circadian rhythm include the suprachiasmatic nucleus, so a part of the brain, as well as melatonin levels, and melatonin are hormones. Now, in some places, they also discuss some genes that may be involved, but we're not going to discuss those today because a lot of the work or the bulk of the work has been done in Drosophila or fruit flies. So we're going to focus in here today on the role of the suprachiasmatic nucleus and melatonin levels in sleep and regulating that biological clock. So the first thing that we're going to talk about that controls our circadian rhythms is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, abbreviated SCN. Now, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is part of the hypothalamus, and it is the main control center for the circadian rhythms of both sleep and temperature. Now, you can see here in this diagram on the right, the suprachiasmatic nucleus sits on the most ventral surface of the brain. This is actually a slice of a rat brain, I believe. Now, here we have a human brain on the left, a sagittal view, and we can see that suprachiasmatic nucleus is right here. It's again kind of that most ventral portion of that hypothalamus that sits right below that thalamus. Now remember, our eyes are going to be up here in the front of our head. This is the front of our brain, our frontal lobe, and light waves are going to hit those eyes, and then they're going to synapse on a couple of different cells and then travel along the optic chiasm. And here we see the optic chiasm, and then they're going to cross over to the contralateral side of the cortex, going back here to the visual cortex. Now, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is named because supra meaning above the chiasm, and it's a nucleus meaning it's a group of cells that work together for a common function. So how does that suprachiasmatic nucleus generate a circadian rhythm? Is it going to be learned or genetic? Now think, it's very deep inside the brain. It is genetic. So it might not be intuitive, but it is genetic. It is something that's inborn, innate on how that SCN generates that circadian rhythm. So one question you might be thinking right now, well, then why don't babies sleep through the night right away? If it's something that we've inherited, if it's something that's inborn or innate, babies don't often sleep through the night until they're 1 year old. So the short answer is going to be that it takes 2 to 4 months for that circadian rhythm to develop. Now, if you think about it, a baby's been in a dark womb for 9 months. Dark, cozy, warm. They're not exposed to any light. So once they are born, they're exposed to all this bright light, which is not a very nice environment for them. It's cold and it's bright, and that's why they cry when they come out, right? So although it's hardwired in, they need help to have that light reset that biological clock, or actually set, because it's never been set, right? So good routines, good patterns help. And if you're really lucky, some babies start sleeping through the night very quickly. Others take a little bit longer. Some start sleeping through the night and then have other things that disrupt them. But nice routines with going to bed, having a bath to relax them, reading a book, even though they're young, reading is good to them, putting them in their nice cozy pajamas, maybe rocking a little bit, and then putting them down in their crib so that they can learn their own soothing patterns. So what is going to reset that SCN every day and keep that biological rhythm on an approximately 24-hour cycle? What did we say was our Zeitgeber? Light, yes, sunlight. Now, you might be thinking, that SCN was pretty deep in the brain. How is it going to be affected by light if it's so deep in the brain? Now, we've talked about how the light waves go from our eyes. We have these receptors in the back of our eyes, the photoreceptors, and then those are going to synapse on a couple of their cells and then send that information along the optic nerve back to the visual cortex. And here we see information from our right visual cortex our right visual field going to our left visual cortex, information from our left visual field going to our right visual cortex. Now you can see some of that information has to cross here at what's called the optic chiasm. Now again, that's pretty deep in the brain. That is information from our eyes, light information going back to the brain. Now, what do you think? What could happen that would allow that information to signal the SCN? there is a specific pathway. It's called the retinohypothalamic pathway. So remember, we talked about how that light information that's going back to the visual cortex is going to synapse in the thalamus first before it goes back to the visual cortex. So there are a couple other little pathways that come off of that optic chiasm. One of those is this retinohypothalamic pathway. So it goes directly from the retina in the back of our eyes to the hypothalamus. And here's the SCN in the hypothalamus. So it's a small branch of the optic nerve that travels directly from the retina to the SCN. So how would this work in blind people? We have this pathway that's going from the retina directly to the SCN. It travels along with that optic nerve, but stops in the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Now, there's different reasons for individuals to lose their sight. One is things that are occurring in the eyes. So a lot of times those photoreceptors aren't responding, or something's wrong with the cornea or the lens or what have you. Now, as long as these specialized cells that go from the retina to the hypothalamus are still functioning, light can still reset the biological clock in individuals that are visually impaired. These are called melanopsin-containing ganglion cells. So they're in the retina, they respond directly to light, and that's from those cells, that's that retinohypothalamic pathway that travels to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And just an interesting little piece of trivia is that blind people or visually impaired people can still have light-sensitive migraines because of these melanopsin-containing ganglion cells. So even though they're not seeing the light, their visual cortex is not being able to process that information for whatever reasons, they still can have these light-sensitive migraines. So how does that suprachiasmatic nucleus regulate waking and sleeping? We know that those melanopsin-containing ganglion cells are going to send information about those light waves directly to the SCN, but how does that translate into the biological clock functioning on a 24-hour cycle? It has to do with how the suprachiasmatic nucleus is then going to control the activity of the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is an endocrine gland that's located posterior to the thalamus, and so you can see here the thalamus in the middle of the brain, the hypothalamus here, and here's the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is posterior to the thalamus, and it's going to secrete a hormone that we know as melatonin. So melatonin, again, a hormone, and it's going to increase sleepiness, and it increases about 2 to 3 hours before bedtime. Now, serotonin is a precursor to melatonin. It becomes acetylated, and then that serotonin turns into melatonin. Now, many of you have probably seen melatonin tablets. They're actually, I think, readily available over the counter now. It used to be they had to be prescribed by a doctor. Some of you may be taking melatonin pills. When I was in graduate school had somebody who was a sleep expert, graduate student, but had worked in a sleep lab for a number of years. And his warning to us all was, don't ever take those melatonin pills because it screws with your body's natural ability to produce those melatonin levels. And that melatonin, again, is going to help you get sleepy. It's released about 2 to 3 hours before bedtime. Now, if you take a melatonin pill, it's supposed to make you sleepy about 2 hours later. Now, there's a catch. So a couple of years ago, I was talking to a colleague, and she said, I don't even talk about melatonin anymore because, didn't you know that melatonin is also released in nocturnal animals a couple of hours before, like around 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. Now, nocturnal animals, obviously, hopefully they stay up all night. So if they're also having this release of melatonin in the evening hours, why aren't they going to sleep? So we don't really know the role that melatonin plays in nocturnal animals, but we do know that you can give melatonin to animals and it will make them go to sleep a couple of hours later. So there's different theories out there. One suggests that maybe the melatonin doesn't trigger sleepiness per se, but triggers nighttime rituals, which then lead us to go to sleep. This is again just showing you the position of the pineal gland posterior to the thalamus. Here we have that suprachiasmatic nucleus that projects to that pineal gland, and then that pineal gland releases melatonin into the bloodstream.